understanding that everybody makes mistakes is really important. And I do
What are
see
you
even the
talking
most
about?
embarrassing.
I don't make mistakes.
Yes, you're perfect, Jessy.
Hey podcast fam, it's your go-to leadership team coach and host, Jessy here, and I'm ready to shake things up. If you're also tired of outdated forms of authority and ready to rebel against the mediocrity of leadership we see today, you might have just found your spot. So join me in unleashing this next generation of leaders by embracing being just a bit too millennial. Let's redefine this thing together. Before we jump back into this interview, part 2 interview with Eve, I wanted to clarify something that's really important to me because I've seen this with a lot of my clients and they've really struggled with it. And it's this idea that accountability and empathy can't coexist. And one of the problems with this is I see that a lot of my leaders fail to set expectations up front because they don't want to be like that boss they had that was overly prescribed, overly rigid, right? Authoritarian vibes for millennial leaders just doesn't sit with us well. And so because they're so afraid to be that person and they want to be this empathetic leader that supports those around them, they fail to set expectations and they overcompensate that with empathy and support. But what happens here is they have expectations. Like you have expectations in your head, and when you don't share those with people, they can't read your mind and they can't guess them. And chances are they're probably not going to act in a way that aligns with what's happening in your brain. Because at the end of the day, we don't want to hurt people's feelings. We want people to like us and think that we see them as adults and that we want them to have autonomy. So I think we tend to swing to the side of empathy early on in how we manage. But then what happens is the tendency is something's going to happen that's going to frustrate you because you aren't sharing the things that you want. You're not being clear. But instead of taking that and saying, okay, I didn't set expectations effectively, what I see is like a pendulum swing to the other side. And what happens when you swing to the other side? Now I'm going to be very prescribed. I'm going to be hyper rigid and hyper vigilant to make sure these things happen. And so it moves from a little bit of chaos and confusion to overly rigid and a really demotivating and disorienting environment for employees. So what do we do about this? Well, the first thing we need to understand is that these two things can coexist. So empathy and accountability, I think, work really well in partnership together. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that we bust this myth and we hold it in our minds that even though these seem paradoxical, they actually work well together. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to set really clear expectations up front. These are difficult conversations. No one likes to have these, but they're important. And if we don't tell people what's going on in our mind, how can they understand and know? It's not actually fair to them. Another thing you can do with setting expectations, which I think is really cool, is actually make this a collaborative process. So you can set your own expectations for them and they can actually then share with you what their expectations are. And you can build these together. The third thing we're going to do is we're going to cultivate effective feedback loops. So once we set expectations, we need to come back to these, whether it's a good conversation or, hey, these are the expectations that you're not meeting. Having feedback loops is important to the process. This is when you get to hold people accountable. These conversations can be beautiful. They can also be hard as well, but I think they're important as a leader. And then the last thing we need to do is we need to acknowledge the limits of our own perspective. And we need to integrate this into steps 1, 2, and 3. This is the empathy component alongside the accountability, which means, hey, this is what I'm seeing. This is my perspective, but I don't always have all the information. I don't. And so there's a limit to what I understand and know. And so I need to be open. I need to have humility and curiosity to try to understand what else is happening that I don't know about. So let's give you the scripts. Let's jump to the scripts because I think we all would agree with how we want to go about this, that this is a great approach to leadership, but it's really hard to put this into action. So let's take maybe a potential feedback conversation and let's put this into action. And remember, this, when you think about this, this conversation is very hard if you haven't set expectations up front. So if you start to give someone feedback and you realize you never actually clarified those expectations first, you missed a step. You got to go back and set those parameters, those guardrails. So what we're going to do when we're in a feedback conversation is the first thing we're going to do is we're going to name the behavior that we're noticing. So I've noticed you've, missed deadlines. And again, this behavior should go back to expectations that your team has set. Once we name the behavior, we might want to clarify why that behavior is important. Missing two deadlines, impacts the team's coordination, and it might cause people to have to work hours that maybe they weren't expecting. And then this is the most important part of the conversation. We want to acknowledge the limits of our perspective. So we're going to ask here an open-ended question. What's going on? Can you tell us more about what's happening here? So again, when I approach the feedback conversation, this is what I might say. I've noticed you've missed two deadlines. As you know, on our team, when we miss deadlines, it impacts how the team can coordinate, but I would love to understand more about what's happening with you and what's going on. So the next time you're concerned with hurting someone's feelings, and so you shy away from setting effective expectations with them, you don't want to have that difficult conversation, or sometimes it's even lashing out because you didn't set the expectation and now they're not doing what you want, just remember this bell hooks quote. Quote, "For me, forgiveness and compassion are always linked. How do we hold people accountable for wrongdoing and yet at the same time remain in touch with their humanity enough to believe in their capacity to be transformed?" So without further ado, let's jump into our interview with Eve. Eve has her psychology degree from Amherst College and a master's from the New School. And she has consistently forged her unique path, whether that's experimenting with recipes alongside Mark Bittman, writing books, or delivering very impactful speeches. And I truly believe her trailblazing approach is fueled by this internal passion rather than the external expectations of those around her, which I truly admire is really hard for me. And so today, we actually get to discuss a lot about this. We get to discuss her fearlessness when it comes to taking risks and really this mindset that she has that leverages setbacks for growth. And I'm really excited. This is one of Eve's superpower skills. So we're going to jump right into the episode. It might feel a little bit disorienting at first because we're leaving off right where we left off in our first episode, but you'll figure out your bearings very quickly. And so enjoy.
It's actually something that I think that I'm relatively good at. And then sometimes I'm like, am I being too kind to myself? Like if I'm really drained and I don't get something done or I make a mistake, I don't know. I don't know why exactly, but I have found peace with saying, you know what, Eve, you messed up and you're not going to do it again. And you really learned something from this and we're going to move forward. But most people that I work with don't have that reaction. It's like, this is massively embarrassing. There's tears. There's a lot of self-criticism. There's a sense of imposter syndrome. And I'm still trying to figure out how to navigate that for others to help cultivate that, again, that kind of fine balance between like self-care, giving yourself grace, self-love, and still encouraging high quality work.
What are some of the things that you've seen where?
I think that I repeat to others what I repeat to myself when I make mistakes. Part of what I really love about the team that we have cultivated at Food for Climate League is that when something isn't done well, there's no finger pointing. There is a kind of collective call to action of like, okay, what could we have done better? How do we move forward? And for me as a leader, what I do is I position this as part of being in a startup, right? That's an ethos that was started in Silicon Valley. of it's prototyping and iterating. And failure is just an opportunity to learn how to do something better. And so that's really how we frame it. If it's, a mistake that's made with all of the best intentions, that's very different than a mistake that's made because you just weren't trying. And at FCL, I will say that I have never actually, never, I have in very few cases witnessed that someone has made a mistake because they just weren't trying. And, and that is more of a leadership question. And, the times that I have seen that, then that person's not the right fit for our organization. But if someone's making a mistake with all of the best intentions, that's not a reason to let somebody go. That's a part of growth. That's a learning opportunity. And so it's framing it that way rather than as a failure.
I love that approach. The two things that reminds me of, one, I think of Amy Edmonson, but Amy Edmonson has a really wonderful framework for mistakes and failure. And what is like really effective failure, and like what is not good failure? Because I think we group it. It's too broad of a term, and we group it into too big. And so we actually have to look at the context behind the failure. So it's a really really great model. I'll link the article in the show notes. And I also wanted to double click on the whole idea of how do we show up for people when they do fail. And it is a really embarrassing moment for them. And I think as leaders, one of the things I see that they fail to do is to just be in that space with them, get on the ground with them. And it's not that you want to feel all of the things that they're feeling, right? We don't want to absorb everyone's emotions, but how do we get on the ground with them? And you might not feel that embarrassment. You might not understand what about the situation is so upsetting. But one of the things leaders miss, because we're trying so hard to soothe that person in front of us. We want them to feel better. We want them to know they're a valuable part of our team, that we forget to just be present with them when they're having a hard time. The ways to build confidence is mistakes, and it's having that self-compassion to pick ourselves up afterwards. It's a really critical part of being able to take risk. And that is what you are. I think that's your superpower, Eve. I really do. All the things you talked about earlier, it's a superpower. I hear you talk about that, and I'm like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, I've known you my whole life, and I'm like, when you do things, I'm always, like I said, I'm always like, what is she doing? And it's because when you make mistakes, again, you have this confidence and you have this compassion for failing that most of us just don't have. It's really unique.
Yeah, I mean, Food for Climate League is not the first endeavor. Right before this, I had a separate concept of a kind of retreat and spent a good amount of time working on that. And it just didn't, I don't feel like that was a waste of time. I learned a lot in that process. Did that business concept work? No. I mean, I just found the files, like my incorporation files, and I was like, oh, right, I made a company. That didn't go anywhere. Like, there's parts of that work that still come up now and again. The person I was collaborating with, I love the opportunity to get to know her better. And it wasn't the right time. It wasn't the right vision for a multitude of reasons. And I think it would be really easy to just be like, oh, Eve, you messed this up, and because of you that this didn't happen. But I think that life is too complicated for that. And usually there isn't one thing to blame. And listen, I also am in a really, really privileged position where I had the financial stability to fail. I think that's another part of this, is like building
I mean, that is not my strength. I'm the sorest loser you've ever met in your life. Yeah. I know I won't lose. And part of it is because, it's painful. It is painful when I lose, when I make mistakes. So painful.
Jessy, you were scary as a kid. I'm not going to lie. I mean, around sports in particular, because of that competitive spirit. But I think that you never, now that you're saying it, I don't ever remember you kind of pointing blame at other people. It always was at yourself. And I think that was always something that was hard to watch, because I also have seen how hard that you work. And but again, it's a different thing too. And I don't know if you've done any research on this, but there's a difference between knowing what you should feel, knowing you should give yourself grace, and then the actual practice of it. So I don't know if you have any recommendations of how can I help others give themselves that grace and forgive themselves and see those mistakes as actually building blocks towards a better performance in the future.
I think for me, I mean, that's a really, really good question. As someone who is highly sensitive, which I think people don't get because I call myself the turtle. Like I'm a turtle, right? Like I got the hard shell because it's protecting that. I think we're like opposite. Like you come across you yourself. I've always admired your vulnerability. I'm a turtle. Like I use jokes to mask any emotion and it's to protect the very sensitive inside. But it doesn't mean I don't feel the way I feel. And one of the things that makes the difference is to connect with me emotionally in that moment.
Hmm.
That there is no appeasing or there's no silver lining or there's nothing you can say to make me feel better in that moment. So what I've learned and how to soothe myself is to accept that this belongs, right? Tara Brach
Hmm.
is my favorite person to listen to. And so we just say, this belongs. This belongs. This feeling belongs. So it's not trying to push it away. It's not trying to change my mind. It's actually the acceptance of that state that helps me move forward. And so many times I have clients coming to me saying, I don't want to feel this way. Help me not feel this way. And like the more you try to push it away, the more it's gonna hurt. And yeah, when I have those states, the way in which I've learned to cope with it is by telling myself this belongs and by seeing the emotions as data for me, that it's telling me something, that I am telling myself something, and that is part of my own intelligence of my body.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah. So for anyone who has a little turtle out there.
I mean, this is not to say that I haven't experienced moments of intense shame. I mean, like I have. I've made, especially when I was younger and in my 20s, yeah, I think that's really when kind of the self-criticism and intense shame came in. I think as an organization, though, as a leader of an organization, I need to frame whatever failures or mistakes we are making as learning opportunities, because they really have been. I mean, the work that we're doing now is completely different than the work that we were doing before. And even for myself, I'm writing a new business contract right now. And I was thinking to myself this morning, like, I never would have known to put X, Y, and Z clause in to the contract last year or 2 years ago. And I'm dealing with the consequences of that in a couple situations. But instead of being mad at myself, I'm just like, there's no way I could have known that. You mean, maybe if I had, lived a different life, but I didn't. And so I just need to accept this, that I didn't put this in the contract before, but now I've lived and I've made those mistakes. And so now I know I'm far more savvy when writing my business contracts, or I know who to send it to have them review it. I know not to rush myself through the process because someone else has a deadline. Too bad. I need to go through this own process myself. But yeah, there's so much learning along the way by making errors, and along the way too, it's just saying, well, okay, how do I manage the errors? How do I make sure that this doesn't turn into something more significant than it is right now?
That is such a great piece of information, I think, for listeners to take with them, in terms of this happens all the time to all of us, and it is so easy to beat yourself up over not knowing the future. We don't have a magical ball as much as we would love to. What advice would you love to go back and give to yourself 4.5 years ago?
I have absolutely no idea.
I love you so much. That is awesome.
What did I give myself? I mean, so it goes back to the same thing of like, well, I could try to educate myself 4 years ago on all the things that I've learned up until now. But I also think that learning process, that failure process, is making me a stronger and better leader, is making me a better and stronger researcher. Something that I wish that I had learned and understood a bit more upfront is really just judging how to hire, who are the right people for your team. I think that some of the best advice that I've gotten along the way is like, if your gut is telling you that a person is not right for your team, you need to get over the emotion of it. There are people who I've really liked personally, like I like them as human beings, but they're not the right fit for the team for a variety of reasons. And I've often not acted because I felt bad. They were my friends. I liked them. I didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings. And that's really been since the very beginning of the organization. And that's been a really hard thing for me to deal with, because relationships are so core to, I think, the work that we do. But over time, I've learned, like, if you're really friends with that person, if you're honest with them about their own skill set, what the needs are of the organization, there's a way to move forward as friends and to continue supporting one another in your career journeys, and to think of this as a career journey. This isn't the end of the road. And so I think that if I really would have appreciated knowing a little bit more, or having more encouragement on that topic in particular from the outset, because I'd never built a team before. I also think that there's something about being a woman. I think there's something about being a relatively young woman, not that young anymore, but in not wanting to hurt somebody's feelings. I think there's like a little bit of that kind of maternal stereotypical hesitancy. I think that there's something really valuable for female leaders in this space. Maybe not even just be, I also have talked to my male friends about this and they feel the same way. So maybe it's not necessarily being a woman.
Know that this is my love language. Is how do you design and build a team? And I think that we undervalue the importance of it within the organizational space. Another thing I wanted to touch on this, which is this idea of having difficult conversations. And there's a part of me that thinks generationally this is something that's going to be impactful for millennial leaders. I think it's something that, and I'm still clarifying my ideas around this, so I'd love your input. But there is this idea. I talked to a client yesterday, and they were concerned of overwhelming other people on their team. There's this sense that I have to take care of you, and I am here to take care of people. And if we look at that too kind of directly, linearly, sometimes that stops us from making decisions that we know are right.
Yes. I mean, I can identify with that hugely. And again, it's this fine line of like, well, someone's my friend and they're going through a hard time, and should I give them the benefit of the doubt because they're going through X, Y, and Z? And it's like, well, but as the executive director of this organization, like X, Y, and Z work isn't getting done. Either because they don't have the right skill set and it's literally just like a matchmaking error, or they do have something else happening in their lives and they're not performing their job the way that they need to be performing it. And I think having those kinds of difficult conversations has been one of the hardest parts for me. It's something I'm still not terribly good at, and our director of operations is much better at it than I am, which is also why I think it's great to have a partner, other people in your organization who you can also talk to and go to for advice, particularly in those kinds of situations. And so I think having great sounding boards and other people you trust to go to.
I call this section the Jolt of Insight, which I'm going to ask just some quick hitting questions. So first things come to mind. All right. So tell me 3 words that you would say describe the state of mind that you've had as a leader in the last 6 months.
State of mind.
Yes.
Focused, aspirational, empathetic.
Right. What is your favorite millennial quality about yourself?
Oh, I actually think it is this idea that I can achieve something. If I get the right people around me, if I get the right advice, not anything, right? I don't think that I can achieve absolutely anything in the world, but there is, maybe it is overconfidence, but I do believe that if you kind of put the right pieces into place, you can achieve a whole lot in this world. And I'm not afraid to step on my own. And I'm not sure that a young woman of a previous generation with a background as a writer would feel comfortable starting a foundation and hiring a team and doing this work.
Agreed. What is your favorite millennial quality about me?
Why did you think about what is millennial about you? I just think of you as like the full package of Jessy. No, actually, I know what it is. I love how emotionally in tune you are. And I think that there are so many different kind of philosophers in this space right now of well-being and leadership. And this is a very millennial space of thinking about how to cultivate kind of the correct organization and play into people's emotions. And you have taken that over the last few years and done a true deep dive and cultivated it in your life. And I think that's super millennial and super awesome.
Yeah, of course. Let's take the research and make it all about me.
Yeah.
Most millennial thing ever. All right. What's one thing you want to change people's mind on?
Oh, I want people to understand that we can use food as a top solution to the climate crisis, and that doesn't mean that you're sacrificing things. It means that we actually need to diversify what we're eating, and that there's a lot of really amazing food experiences ahead for us.
You could offer one actionable piece of advice to our listeners. What would it be?
On leadership?
No, it can be on climate and food.
One actionable piece of advice. Well, actually, I think my actionable piece of advice is the same for leadership as it would be for changing your eating habits, which is one day at a time and be kind to yourself. I have a lot of people in my life right now who are watching You Are What You Eat on Netflix, or they're watching the Blue Zones special on Netflix, and they're saying, I really do need to change what it is that I'm eating for climate reasons, but also for my physical health and my mental health. And they say, but I don't know where to start. I eat meat every day. I don't know how to cook. And again, I think this is about being empathetic, accepting the fact that, yeah, you're going to have to learn some new skills. You're going to have to try some things out. There's going to be some failures. Why don't you try to say, okay, one day a week, you're going to be plant-based and you're just going to do the research on that plant-based meal. And then you can slowly increase kind of your commitment to it as you increase your skills so that you feel confident in doing it. And that for me was, taking out red meat, and then it was reducing chicken, and then it was, taking away some farmed salmon. And while I should say you're taking those things away, but in the meantime, you're learning to cook all of these new things. So I'm adding way more to my diet than I'm removing. I'd say one day at a time. And it's the same thing for leadership. I think it's, allowing yourself the space to fail, but also, like we were saying before, you can't assume, oh, I really wish I would have known this. You can't know it until you live it and until you try it.
I love that answer. Where can people find you? Where can they learn more? Where can they buy your book?
Yeah.
By the way, thank you for using, I know that you did this on purpose, which is to use my favorite color for your book.
It is your favorite color.
By me. Yeah, you're like, oh, Jessy will like that. I'm going to use that.
So you can learn more about Food for Climate League at foodforclimateleague.org. I know it's very long. I'm working to change it to foodforclimate.org in the future. But Food for Climate League, LEAGUE. On myself and information on the book, you can go to Turow-Paul.com. Turow is Turow, and then Paul like the person.com. And you can email directly through either of those websites. And you can also buy my book through my own personal website. You can also request it from your local bookstore.
Lovely. And before we head off, I did want to make sure you got your certificate of participation.
Woo-hoo!
That I colored myself. As you can see, I'm highly artistic.
I love the gamification of the reward system.
You are now a member of the Too Millennial family. You're just Too Millennial.
I'm going to put it on my office wall.
And before we leave, I had to pull this one up because it's just too cute.
Oh, yeah, that's my favorite photo.
Who would have thought? Who would have thought these two little cuties would be, one being an amazing leader and client activist, and the other one trying to start a podcast. I want to give a big thanks to Eve for kicking the podcast off with these wonderful interviews. Before we go, I wanted to drop this quote from Amy Edmonson, who's the lead research on failure and just came out with a book called Right Kind of Wrong: The Science of Failing Well. Quote, "Failure can be a gift, even if it didn't feel like one at the time." End quote. Why does failure feel so bad in the moment? Well, understanding the pain of failure involves acknowledging the emotional response, what that mistake says about who we are as a person. And in a success-driven world where there's this underlying pressure that we have to be successful and right to be worthy, failure can be viewed as this ego-threatening event, right? It activates the fear of looking bad, and it triggers our amygdala, which is the threat response center in the brain. And so according to Edmonson, this can create a flood of potential guilt and shame, which ultimately hinders the learning process. So here's the thing. We don't need to try to ignore or get rid of these truly painful feelings. What it's about acknowledging that it sucks, naming the feeling first, and letting ourselves just feel bad for a time. Because if we jump in and try to find that silver lining in those moments, we're not in a place of learning. And when we push our feelings away, the more they'll linger, whether we realize it or not. An example of this that I'll share is, you also all know that I'm a parent, and I absolutely love Dr. Becky, who's a parenting expert. And she advises parents to give kids those quote unquote life lessons when their child is not flooded with emotions, because kids can't learn in the middle of a tantrum. So as adults, even if we are better at self-regulation, I still believe if we try to jump straight into the learning, we're not going to be effective at learning anything. So just remember, give yourself the space to feel. And once you're ready, give yourself the space to reflect on what has happened. If you want to learn more, I have actually developed a step-by-step approach on how you bounce back from failure and mistakes. This guide, called The 5 Steps for Riding the Failure Roller Coaster, it's like a precursor to how you fail well. And I've actually linked it in the show notes. So it's 5 steps. It's really clear. And it talks about how you move from this emotional state of shame, blame, frustration, anger, disappointment into a place of learning. And that's a wrap for today's episode of Too Millennial. If you found yourself nodding along, you know the drill. Smash that subscribe button wherever you're tuning in. And if you want a daily dose of leadership wisdom with a sidekick of quirky parent jokes, catch me on Instagram at Coach Jessy Grossman. But hey, if you're serious about leveling up yourself, your team, head over to zlncoaching.com, where we have great tools, resources, and case studies that will help you unlock your potential and enhance your team's resilience and performance. Because here's the truth. When we don't invest time in building our own leadership skills and the skills of those around us, problems fester. We feel disconnected, and it's just so hard to get work done. So if you need an executive coach, a sounding board, an offsite facilitator, a team consultant, get in touch. Thanks for hanging out with me on Too Millennial. Until next time, stay curious, stay bold, and keep growing.